Robert had been driving a taxi for 12 years. Every morning at 5, while the city was still sleeping, he'd kiss his wife goodbye and head out into the darkness. At 63 years old, his body reminded him daily that he wasn't young anymore. His back ached from sitting for long hours. His eyes got tired from the headlights and street lamps. But the bills didn't care about his age, so he kept driving. He knew every street in the city like the back of his hand. He'd picked up thousands of people over the years. Business people heading to airports. Tourists looking confused with their maps. Young couples going to fancy restaurants. Late-night workers heading home after their shifts. Most people barely looked at him. To them, he was just the guy driving the car. And that was okay. Robert had made peace with being invisible a long time ago. That Tuesday morning started like any other. The rain was coming down hard, making the streets shine under the streetlights. Robert pulled up to the Grand Meridian Hotel, one of the expensive ones downtown. A man got in the back seat and Robert could tell right away that something was wrong. The guy was wearing a suit that probably cost more than Robert made in a month, but his tie was loose and his hair was messy. His eyes were red like he'd been crying or hadn't slept in days. "Airport, please," the man said quietly, then went silent. Robert started driving. He glanced in the rearview mirror a few times and saw the passenger staring out the window. The man's phone kept buzzing with messages, but he ignored them all. About halfway to the airport, Robert noticed the guy wiping his eyes, trying to hide it by turning toward the window. Robert had learned something important in 12 years of driving. Sometimes people need silence. Sometimes they need someone who won't ask questions or try to make small talk. So he just drove, keeping his eyes on the wet roads. The drive to the airport usually took about 40 minutes. They didn't speak a single word the entire time. When Robert pulled up to the departures area, he checked the meter. $42. The passenger pulled out his wallet and handed over a $50 bill. "Keep the change," the man said, his voice flat and tired. Robert was about to thank him when the passenger did something unexpected. He looked directly at Robert for the first time during the entire ride. His eyes were full of pain, the kind of pain that goes deep. "You remind me of my father," the man said suddenly. Robert didn't know what to say. He just waited. "He drove a cab too," the passenger continued, his voice breaking slightly. "Worked himself to death doing it." He paused, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. I don't know why I told you that." Before Robert could respond, the man quickly opened the door, but Robert did something he rarely did. He got out of the taxi, rain immediately soaking his jacket. He called out, "Sir, wait." The passenger turned around, looking surprised. Robert walked over and held out the $8 in change. "Take this," he said. "Buy yourself a coffee at the airport. You look like you need it more than I do." The man stared at the crumpled bills in Robert's hand like he'd never seen money before. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For a long moment, they just stood there in the rain. Two strangers connected by something neither of them could quite explain. Thank you," the man finally whispered, taking the money. His hand was shaking. Robert nodded and hurried back to his taxi before he got completely soaked. As he drove away, he watched in his rearview mirror as the passenger stood there in the rain, still holding those $8, staring at them like they meant something more than their value. Robert thought about that moment as he drove through the rainy streets looking for his next fare. The man had said his father drove a cab and worked himself to death. Robert understood that fear. He was 63 and still working 6 days a week, 10 hours a day sometimes. He worried about the same thing. What if he collapsed behind the wheel one day? What if his heart gave out before he could save enough for retirement? But something about that passenger had touched him. The man had money, that was obvious. But money hadn't protected him from whatever pain he was carrying. And for some reason, seeing Robert had brought up memories of his father. Robert knew what it was like to work hard your whole life. He knew what it was like to sacrifice everything for your family. Maybe that passenger's father had been the same kind of man. Robert stopped at a red light and looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His hair was completely gray now. His face had deep lines from years of squinting at roads and dealing with traffic. When had he gotten so old? When had the years slipped away like this? He shook his head and focused on the road. There was no point in getting emotional. He had 6 more hours to drive before his shift ended. His wife needed her medication, and that wasn't cheap. The rent was due next week. This was his life, and it was too late to change it now. Robert didn't know it yet, but giving back those $8 had just changed everything. That simple act of kindness, that moment of seeing another human being's pain and responding to it, would come back to him in ways he couldn't imagine. Sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest waves. Sometimes giving away what little you have opens doors you didn't even know existed. But right now, Robert was just a 63-year-old taxi driver in the rain, looking for his next passenger, completely unaware that his life was about to transform in ways he'd never dreamed possible. 3 days passed, and Robert had almost forgotten about the man at the airport. He'd picked up hundreds of other passengers since then. Life moved on quickly when you drove a taxi. Every day brought new faces, new destinations, new stories he'd never hear the end of. It was Friday afternoon when something strange happened. Robert was stopped at a red light downtown when he heard a car horn behind him. Not an angry honk, but someone trying to get his attention. He looked in his mirror and saw a fancy black car. The driver was waving at him frantically. Robert pulled over to the side, confused. Had he cut someone off without realizing it? Was someone angry at him? His heart was beating faster. At his age, confrontation wasn't something he looked forward to. A young woman in a business suit jumped out of the black car and hurried over to his window. She was slightly out of breath, holding her phone in one hand. "Excuse me, are you Robert Chen? Taxi number 847? She asked, checking her phone screen. Robert felt his stomach drop. "Yes, that's me. What's wrong? Did I do something?" No, nothing wrong," she said quickly. "I work for a company called Harrison Technologies. My boss was your passenger on Tuesday morning. He's been trying to track you down." Robert's mind raced. Harrison Technologies. He'd heard that name before. Wasn't that one of those huge tech companies? The ones worth billions of dollars? Why would he be looking for me? Robert asked, genuinely confused. The woman smiled kindly. "He didn't tell me all the details, but he asked me to find you. He'd like you to come to our office building today at 2 o'clock. It's important." Robert looked at his watch. It was already noon. "I'm working," he said. "I can't just leave my shift. I'll lose money." "We'll compensate you for any fares you miss," the woman assured him. She handed him a business card with an address on it. "Please, he was very insistent that I find you. He said it was urgent." After she left, Robert sat in his taxi staring at the card. His hands were shaking slightly. What could a tech billionaire possibly want with him? Had he left something valuable in the taxi? Was Robert in some kind of trouble? He called his wife. "Helen, something weird just happened," he said, explaining the situation. "Maybe he wants to thank you properly," Helen suggested. "You gave him back his money, remember? Maybe he appreciated that. Nobody tracks down a taxi driver just to say thank you," Robert said doubtfully. "Well, there's only one way to find out," Helen replied. "Go see what he wants." At 2 o'clock, Robert stood in the lobby of a building so tall he couldn't see the top when he looked up. Everything was marble and glass and expensive looking. People in suits walked past him quickly, talking on their phones, looking important. Robert felt completely out of place in his worn jacket and taxi driver's cap. He almost turned around and left, but the receptionist had already seen him. She smiled professionally and made a phone call. A few minutes later, another young woman came down to escort him upstairs. They rode an elevator that moved so fast Robert's ears popped. When the doors opened, he was looking at an office that took up the entire top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the whole city spread out below them. And there, standing by the window, was the man from Tuesday morning. Except he looked completely different now. That broken, tired man had been replaced by someone who looked powerful and in control. This was clearly someone important, someone who commanded attention when he walked into a room. "Mr. Chen, thank you so much for coming," the man said, walking over with his hand extended. "I'm David Harrison. Please, sit down." Robert shook his hand and sat carefully on the edge of an expensive leather chair. He felt like he might break something just by being there. David sat across from him and took a deep breath. "I want to explain why I asked you here. That morning when you drove me to the airport, I was coming from the hospital. My father had just died 2 hours earlier." Robert felt his chest tighten. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly. "He was a taxi driver," David continued. "His whole life. He worked 16-hour days to put me through college, to give me opportunities he never had. He died of a heart attack behind the wheel of his cab." David's voice remained steady, but Robert could see the pain in his eyes. Robert didn't know what to say. He thought about his own life, driving 10-hour days at 63. He thought about his own heart, how tired he felt sometimes. "When you gave me back that tip," David said, "when you told me to buy coffee instead, something broke open inside me. Do you know why?" Robert shook his head. "Because my father used to do exactly that. If he picked up someone who looked sad or troubled, he'd refuse tips. He'd say, 'Keep it, you need it more than me.' I'd forgotten that about him. I'd been so busy building this company, making money, closing deals, that I'd forgotten the kind of man my father was. I'd barely seen him in the last 5 years. I was always too busy." David stood and walked back to the window. "After you drove away, I sat in that airport for 3 hours. I missed my flight to Tokyo, a $200 million deal that my board is furious about. But sitting there, holding those $8 you gave me back, I realized something. I'd become someone my father wouldn't recognize. I'd forgotten what actually matters." Robert felt tears burning in his eyes. He understood that feeling. How many times had he left for work before his wife woke up? How many dinners had he missed? How many conversations had he been too tired to have? "Mr. Chen, can I ask you something personal?" "How old are you?" 63, Robert answered. "And how much longer do you plan to drive a taxi?" Robert looked down at his hands. They were rough and calloused, marked by years of gripping a steering wheel. "As long as I can, I guess. My wife has medical bills. We have rent. I don't really have a choice." David nodded slowly, like Robert had confirmed something he already suspected. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "Bring in those papers we prepared." A woman entered with a folder. Robert's heart was racing. What was happening? "Mr. Chen," David said, his voice formal but somehow deeply personal. "I want to offer you a job. We have a fleet of corporate vehicles and drivers here at Harrison Technologies. The position pays $90,000 a year, full health benefits for you and your wife, retirement plan. Monday through Friday, 8-hour shifts. No weekends." Robert's mouth went dry. 90,000? He currently made about 38,000 a year working 6 days a week. This had to be a joke. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. "But that's not really why I'm offering this," David continued. 3 days ago in your taxi, you showed me something I'd lost. You showed me that kindness is worth more than money, that seeing another person's pain matters more than profit. My father knew that. You know that. And I need people around me who remember that truth." Robert couldn't speak. His whole body was shaking. This couldn't be real. People didn't get their lives changed because they gave back $8. That wasn't how the world worked. But looking at David Harrison's face, Robert realized this was actually happening. One small act of kindness had somehow led to this moment, and his life would never be the same again. Robert stared at David Harrison like the man had just spoken a foreign language. $90,000 a year. The number kept repeating in his head, but it wouldn't make sense. It was more than double what he made now. It was more money than he'd ever imagined earning. "I don't understand," Robert finally managed to say. "Why would you do this?" "I just gave you back $8. Anyone would have done that." David shook his head slowly. "No, Robert. Most people wouldn't have. Most people would have taken that tip and driven away without a second thought. You saw I was hurting, and you responded with kindness even though you probably needed that money more than I did." He paused. "Can I tell you what happened after you left?" Robert nodded, still trying to process everything. "I sat in the airport terminal holding those bills. People were walking past me, rushing to their flights, and I was just sitting there crying. A security guard asked if I was okay. I couldn't even answer him." David's voice got quieter. "I called my assistant and told her to cancel everything. All my meetings, the Tokyo deal, everything. Then I called my mother. We talked for the first time in 4 months. Really talked, not just quick phone calls where I'm distracted by emails." Robert listened, his throat tight with emotion. "She told me that Dad had been asking about me, wondering when I'd visit. He wanted to show me something he'd written, some advice for me about business and life. But he never got the chance because I was always too busy. And now I'll never know what he wanted to tell me." David's composure cracked for just a moment. "I can't get that time back. I can't tell him I'm sorry. I can't tell him I love him one more time." "I'm sure he knew," Robert said softly. "Fathers know even when we don't say it." "Maybe," David said. "But I should have said it anyway. I should have made time. And I would have kept making the same mistakes if you hadn't given me back that money. You made me stop and remember what my father taught me. That's worth more than any business deal." Robert wiped his eyes. He was thinking about his own children. grown now with families of their own. When was the last time he'd really talked to them? He was always so tired, always worried about money. David walked over to his desk and picked up the folder. I've thought about this carefully. I'm not offering you this job out of pity or guilt. I'm offering it because I meant what I said. I need people around me who understand what actually matters in life. This company has 3,000 employees. We make billions of dollars every year. But we've lost something along the way. We've forgotten that we're dealing with human beings, not just numbers on a spreadsheet. He opened the folder and showed Robert the papers. This is a standard employment contract. You'd start in 2 weeks, which gives you time to wrap things up with the taxi company. You'd be part of our executive transport team, driving company vehicles for board members and visiting executives. It's basically what you already do, but with better hours, better pay, and benefits that will take care of you and your wife. Robert's hands trembled as he looked at the papers. The numbers were real. This was actually happening. I don't know what to say, he whispered. Say yes, David replied with a gentle smile. Let me do something good with the money I've made. Let me honor my father's memory by helping someone who reminds me of him. Robert thought about Helen. She'd been dealing with health problems for the past 2 years. The medications were expensive and their insurance barely covered anything. He thought about how worried she was every time he left for work, afraid that he'd push himself too hard and end up like David's father. This job would change everything for them. Yes, Robert said, his voice breaking. Yes, I'll take the job. Thank you. I don't know how to thank you enough. David stood and extended his hand. You already did. 3 days ago in the rain. They shook hands and Robert felt like he was in a dream. This kind of thing didn't happen in real life. It didn't happen to 63-year-old taxi drivers who were just trying to pay their bills. As Robert got up to leave, David stopped him. Wait, there's one more thing. He walked back to his desk and pulled out an envelope. I want you to take this. What is it? Robert asked. A bonus. Your first payment, if you will. I want you to take your wife somewhere nice. A real vacation. 2 weeks, anywhere you want to go. When was the last time you two had a vacation? Robert's mind went blank. A vacation? He couldn't even remember. Maybe 15 years ago they'd driven to the coast for a long weekend. I don't think we've ever had a real vacation, he admitted. There was never time or money for it. Then it's long overdue, David said, handing him the envelope. Robert opened it and his knees nearly gave out. The check was for $25,000. I can't accept this, he said immediately. This is too much. This is crazy. My father never got to take my mother to Hawaii like they'd planned, David said quietly. He died still talking about it, still saying next year and when I save enough. Don't make that mistake, Robert. Take your wife on that trip. Make those memories while you still can. Robert couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They just came, flowing down his face right there in that expensive office with its view of the entire city. He wasn't ashamed. This was too much, too overwhelming, too impossibly generous. David walked him to the elevator. I'll have someone contact you next week with all the details about your start date and orientation. And Robert, thank you. Thank you for reminding me what my father tried to teach me all those years. As the elevator descended, Robert leaned against the wall, clutching the envelope. His whole body was shaking. When the doors opened in the lobby, he walked out into the afternoon sunshine and just stood there for a moment, letting it all sink in. He pulled out his phone and called Helen. When she answered, he couldn't even speak at first. Robert, are you okay? What happened? Her voice was worried. Helen, he finally managed. Pack your bags. What? Why, what's going on? We're going to Hawaii, he said, his voice full of wonder. We're going to Hawaii and I got a new job and everything's different now. Everything just changed. He could hear her crying on the other end of the line. What are you talking about? Robert, you're scaring me. What happened? I gave a sad man $8 back, Robert said, laughing and crying at the same time. That's all I did. I gave him back $8 and now we're going to Hawaii. That night, Robert sat at their small kitchen table with Helen, explaining everything that had happened. She kept shaking her head in disbelief, looking at the check, looking at the contract papers, looking at her husband like he'd returned from another planet. This is real? She kept asking. This is actually real? It's real, Robert assured her. I start in 2 weeks. $90,000 a year, full health benefits. Monday through Friday, 8-hour days. No more weekends. No more 10-hour shifts. Helen burst into tears again. I've been so worried about you, she sobbed. Every day you leave, I worry you won't come back. I worry your heart will give out like your father's did. I've been so scared, but we needed the money for my medicine, and I didn't want to burden you with my fears. Robert held her close. No more worrying. We're going to be okay. For the first time in our lives, we're actually going to be okay. Later that night, lying in bed, Robert couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the chain of events. If he hadn't picked up David that morning, if David hadn't mentioned his father, if Robert hadn't given back that money, any one of those things could have been different and none of this would have happened. But it had happened. One small choice, one moment of compassion had changed everything. Robert had been taught his whole life that hard work was the only path forward, that you kept your head down and did your job and hoped things would work out. Nobody had ever told him that kindness could open doors, that seeing another person's pain and responding to it could transform your entire life. He thought about David's father, the taxi driver who had worked himself to death. Robert had been heading down that same road. But somehow, through an encounter neither of them could have predicted, both he and David had been given a second chance. David had remembered what mattered, and Robert had been given the gift of time to actually live instead of just survive. Sometimes miracles don't look like miracles at first. Sometimes they look like a rainy morning, a sad passenger, and 8 crumpled dollar bills. Sometimes they're hidden in the smallest acts of human kindness, waiting to bloom into something neither person could have imagined. 2 weeks later, Robert drove his old taxi for the last time. He'd said goodbye to the dispatcher, the mechanics who'd kept his car running, and the other drivers he'd shared coffee with during breaks. They'd all been shocked by his news. Some were happy for him. Others seemed almost resentful, like his good fortune somehow highlighted their own struggles. Robert understood. A month ago, he would have felt the same way. On his first day at Harrison Technologies, Robert arrived an hour early. He couldn't help it. The nervousness kept him awake all night. A woman from Human Resources met him in the lobby and took him through orientation. Everything was new and strange. The building had a cafeteria that served free lunch. There was a gym, a meditation room, things Robert had never imagined a workplace could have. We take care of our people here, the HR woman explained. Mr. Harrison believes that happy, healthy employees do better work. It's not just talk. He really means it. Robert was assigned a vehicle, a beautiful black sedan that was only 6 months old. It smelled new. Everything worked perfectly. After 12 years of driving a taxi with broken air conditioning and a check engine light that never went off, this felt like a spaceship. His first assignment was to drive one of the board members to a meeting across town. The man got in the back seat, barely looked at Robert, and immediately started making phone calls. Robert drove in silence, which was fine. He was used to being invisible. But when they arrived, the board member actually looked at him and said, "Thank you. Nice smooth driving." It was such a small thing being thanked, but after years of passengers who never acknowledged him at all, it meant something. At the end of his first day, David stopped by the garage where Robert was parking the car. "How was day 1?" he asked. "Strange," Robert admitted. "Good strange, but strange. I keep thinking I'll wake up and find out this was all a dream." David laughed. "It's not a dream. You earned this, Robert. Never forget that." He paused. "Have you and Helen planned your vacation yet?" "We're going next month," Robert said, his face lighting up. "She can't stop looking at pictures of Hawaii online. She cries every time she talks about it. I don't think she actually believed it was real until we booked the flights." "Good," David said. "You both deserve it." As David walked away, Robert felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope that tomorrow would be slightly better than today, but real hope that the future could actually be good. The next month passed quickly. Robert settled into his new routine. 8-hour days felt like a vacation compared to his old 10-hour shifts. He actually had energy when he got home. He and Helen would sit together after dinner and talk, really talk, about their days and their plans and their dreams. Dreams they'd stopped having years ago because survival took all their energy. Then came the Hawaii trip. When they landed in Honolulu, Helen gripped Robert's hand so tightly it hurt. "We're really here," she kept saying. "We're actually here." They spent 2 weeks in paradise. They walked on beaches. They watched sunsets. They ate at nice restaurants without checking the prices first. Helen went snorkeling for the first time in her life. Robert rented a car and they drove around the island, stopping wherever looked interesting, without worrying about getting back to work. One evening, they were sitting on the beach watching the sun go down, painting the sky in colors that didn't seem real. Helen turned to him with tears streaming down her face. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Last year when my health got bad, I thought about asking you to retire. I knew we couldn't afford it, but I was so scared of losing you. I was so scared you'd die in that taxi like your father did." She was sobbing now. "But I couldn't ask you to stop because we needed the money for my medicine. So I just worried every single day. And now look at us. How did this happen?" Robert pulled her close. "A man lost his father. I gave him back $8, and somehow that turned into this." "It's more than that," Helen said. "You've always been kind. Your whole life. You've given away tips before when you thought someone needed it more. You've let people ride for free when they couldn't pay. You've always seen people, really seen them when the rest of the world looks right through them. This isn't luck, Robert. This is kindness coming back to you." Robert had never thought of it that way. He'd just done what felt right in the moment. But maybe Helen was right. Maybe all those small acts of compassion over the years had been building to something. When they returned home, tanned and relaxed and closer than they'd been in years, Robert found a message waiting from David. There was a board meeting next week, and David wanted Robert to be there. "Why would I need to be at a board meeting?" Robert asked when he called back. "You'll see," David said mysteriously. "Just be there. Wear something nice." The morning of the board meeting, Robert put on the new suit Helen had insisted on buying him. He felt ridiculous. He was just a driver, but he went anyway. The boardroom was on the top floor, all glass and expensive furniture. About 20 people in suits were sitting around a massive table. Robert was told to sit in a chair along the wall, away from the table. He felt completely out of place. David stood up to speak. "Thank you all for coming. Before we go through the usual agenda, I want to talk about something important. This company has been incredibly successful. We've made billions of dollars. Our stock price keeps rising. By every financial measure, we're doing great." The board members nodded, looking pleased. "But we've lost something along the way," David continued. "We've forgotten that behind every employee ID number is a human being with a family, with struggles, with dreams. We've become so focused on quarterly earnings that we've stopped seeing the people who actually make this company work." Some of the board members shifted uncomfortably. 3 months ago, I met someone who reminded me what my father tried to teach me all my life. That people matter more than profits. That kindness is not weakness. That taking care of others is not just good ethics, it's good business. David gestured to Robert. "This is Robert Chen. He's one of our drivers. 3 months ago, he was driving a taxi, working 60-hour weeks at 63 years old just to pay for his wife's medical bills. He picked me up on the worst morning of my life, saw I was hurting, and gave me back the tip I'd given him. Told me to buy myself a coffee, $8 that he probably needed more than I did. That act of kindness changed my life. It reminded me of who I wanted to be." The room was completely silent now. "I'm proposing we make changes to how we treat our employees," David announced. "Every person who works for Harrison Technologies will receive enhanced healthcare coverage starting next quarter. No one will have to choose between their health and their bills. We're also implementing a 15% minimum salary increase across the company, and we're revising our family leave policies to actually allow people to be with their families when it matters." Several board members started objecting at once. "Do you know how much that will cost?" one man demanded. Our shareholders will be fine," David cut him off. "We made $3.2 billion last year. We can afford to share it with the people who made that possible. And if our shareholders have a problem with treating human beings with dignity, they can sell their stock." Another board member spoke up, "But this sets a precedent. Other companies will." "I hope they do," David said firmly. "I hope every company starts treating their people better. Maybe if they did, we'd have fewer burned-out employees, fewer people working themselves to death, fewer families struggling just to survive. My father was one of those people. He worked himself to death so I could have opportunities." Robert was heading down that same path. "I'm not going to stand by and let that happen to the people who work for us." Robert sat there, tears running down his face, as the board argued back and forth. Some supported David. Others were concerned about costs and precedent. But in the end, David's proposal passed. The changes would be implemented. After the meeting, several board members came over to shake Robert's hand. "Thank you," one woman said. "My father was a factory worker. He died at 59. Maybe if his company had cared about him the way David is trying to care for our people, he'd still be here." David walked Robert out. "I need to tell you something," he said. "When I first had this idea, I was nervous. I thought the board might reject it entirely. But then I thought about you giving me back those $8 when you needed them more than I did. If you could do that, I could do this. Your courage gave me courage." "I wasn't being courageous," Robert protested. "I just saw someone who was hurting." "Exactly," David said. "That's what courage looks like. Seeing past your own struggles to recognize someone else's pain. That's the kind of person I want to be. That's the kind of company I want to lead." That night, Robert told Helen everything. 3,000 people are going to get better health care and higher salaries, he said, still in disbelief. "Because I gave someone $8 back." "No," Helen corrected gently. "Because you were kind when you didn't have to be. Because you saw someone else's pain, even though you had plenty of your own." That kindness rippled outward. First it touched David, then it touched you and me. Now it's touching 3,000 more people. That's the power of compassion, Robert. It multiplies. Robert thought about that as he lay in bed that night. One act of kindness had become 2, then 10, then 3,000. How far would those ripples spread? How many lives would be touched because he'd made one choice to care about another human being? He'd never know the full extent. But he knew this: kindness was never wasted. Even when you couldn't see the results, even when nothing seemed to change, the act of caring about another person mattered. It always mattered. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you got to see just how much. 2 years had passed since that rainy Tuesday morning. Robert could barely recognize his own life anymore. He'd stopped driving the corporate car 6 months ago when David promoted him to something called Director of Employee Relations. Robert had laughed when he first heard the title, a taxi driver directing employee relations, but David had been serious. "You understand something most executives never learn," David had told him. "You understand what it's like to struggle. You know what workers need because you've been there. That's worth more than any business degree." Now Robert spent his days talking to employees, listening to their concerns, helping them solve problems. He'd helped create a daycare center in the building, so parents didn't have to worry about childcare. He'd started a program where employees could get advances on their paychecks during emergencies without interest or penalties. He'd even convinced David to let employees bring their dogs to work once a week, because he'd noticed how much happier people seemed when they talked about their pets. The changes at Harrison Technologies had made national news. Other companies were watching. Some were copying their policies. David had been interviewed on television, talking about how treating people well was not just moral but profitable. Employee retention was up. Productivity was up. People actually wanted to work there. But for Robert, the most important change was personal. Helen was healthier now, with the better insurance covering her treatments. His daughter had just had a baby, and Robert had been able to take 2 weeks off to help her without worrying about losing income. His son called him more often now that Robert actually had time to talk. Life had slowed down enough for him to actually live it. Every year on the anniversary of David's father's death, they went together to visit the grave. It had become a tradition, a quiet moment to remember the man who had unknowingly brought them together. The cemetery was on the outskirts of the city, a peaceful place with old trees and winding paths. This year, as they stood by the grave, David was quieter than usual. He'd brought flowers like always, yellow roses because his mother said those were his father's favorite. But he just stood there for a long time, not saying anything. "You okay?" Robert finally asked. David took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about something. Next month is my father's birthday. He would have been 70. He paused. "I want to do something to honor him. Something bigger than just visiting his grave once a year." "What did you have in mind?" "I want to start a foundation," David said, "for working people who are struggling. Taxi drivers, factory workers, retail employees, people who work hard but can barely make ends meet. We could help with medical bills, education for their kids, emergency expenses, the things my father worried about his whole life. The things you worried about before we met." Robert felt his throat tighten. "That's beautiful, David. He'd love that. Would you help me run it?" David asked. "You'd know better than anyone how to actually help people. How to make sure the money goes where it's really needed." "Of course," Robert said without hesitation. "I'd be honored." They stood in silence for a while, both thinking about the man buried beneath their feet. A man who had worked himself to death trying to give his son a better life. A man whose values had shaped his son even when that son had temporarily forgotten them. A man whose legacy was now spreading far beyond what he could have imagined. "You know what I think about sometimes?" David said quietly. "If you hadn't given me back that money, if I'd just gotten on that plane to Tokyo, my father would have died and I would have just kept going. Kept working, kept making deals, kept missing what mattered. I would have looked up one day and realized I'd wasted my whole life chasing money while ignoring everything else." "You don't know that," Robert said. "You might have figured it out eventually, maybe, but it would have been too late. I needed that wake-up call right then, at that exact moment. You gave me that." David turned to look at Robert. "Do you ever think about how random it was? That I got in your taxi that specific morning? If I'd been 5 minutes earlier or later, I would have gotten a different driver. None of this would have happened." Robert had thought about it many times. The perfect timing, the exact combination of circumstances that had to align. "I don't think it was random," he said slowly. "I think we were supposed to meet. I think your father somehow arranged it." David smiled, wiping his eyes. "My mother says the same thing. She says Dad is proud of both of us." They walked back through the cemetery together, past rows of headstones marking lives that had ended. But for Robert and David, that grave represented not an ending but a beginning. The beginning of a friendship that had changed both their lives. The beginning of changes that had spread to thousands of people. The beginning of a new way of thinking about what really mattered. A few months later, the Harrison Foundation held its first event. They'd invited taxi drivers, delivery workers, janitors, security guards, and other working people from around the city. The ballroom was filled with people who rarely got invited to fancy events, looking slightly uncomfortable in borrowed suits and dresses. Robert stood at the microphone to speak. Public speaking terrified him, but David had insisted. "They need to hear from someone like them," David had said. "Someone who understands." "Good evening," Robert began, his voice shaking slightly. 2 years ago, I was driving a taxi. I was 63 years old and exhausted. I worried constantly about money, about my wife's health, about whether I'd be able to keep working or if my body would give out. I imagine some of you feel the same way." He saw heads nodding throughout the room. "One day I picked up a passenger who looked like he was carrying the weight of the world. His father had just died, and his father had been a taxi driver just like me. Just like some of you. When we got to the airport, I gave him back his tip because I could see he needed kindness more than I needed $8. Robert paused, looking out at all those faces. Working faces. Tired faces. Faces that showed the wear of hard lives honestly lived. That small act changed everything. It changed my life. It changed his life. And now, through this foundation, we hope it will change your lives too, because you deserve better. You deserve to work hard without destroying your health. You deserve to take care of your families without constant anxiety about money. You deserve to be seen and valued for the work you do every single day." The applause started slowly and then grew until the whole room was standing, clapping, many with tears in their eyes. These were people who were rarely acknowledged, rarely thanked, rarely told they mattered. Robert knew because he'd been one of them. David spoke next, telling the story of his father, of the sacrifices he'd made, of the lessons he'd taught. "My father believed that every person deserved dignity," David said. "He believed that hard work should be respected, that struggling families should be supported, that kindness should be repaid with kindness. This foundation exists to honor that belief, to honor him, and to honor all of you." Over the next year, the foundation helped hundreds of families. They paid medical bills for a delivery driver who'd had a stroke. They provided scholarships for the children of janitors and security guards. They helped a single mother avoid eviction when her hours got cut. They created a network of support for people who had nowhere else to turn. Each time they helped someone, Robert thought about that rainy morning. $8 had turned into millions of dollars helping thousands of people. One moment of compassion had multiplied into a movement, but the foundation wasn't the end of the story. Other companies started their own programs after seeing what Harrison Technologies was doing. Articles were written, documentaries were made, David gave speeches at business schools about how caring for employees created better companies. The conversation was changing, slowly but surely, about how workers should be treated. And through it all, Robert and David remained close friends. They had lunch together every week. They talked about their families, their dreams, their struggles. The billionaire CEO and the former taxi driver, connected by grief and kindness and a shared understanding of what really mattered. One evening, Helen and Robert were sitting on their porch watching the sunset. They'd bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood, something they'd never thought possible. Their medical bills were managed. Their retirement was secure. They had time for their children and grandchildren. Life was good in a way it had never been before. "Do you miss driving?" Helen asked. Robert thought about it. "Sometimes. I miss the simplicity of it. Just me and the road and the passengers. But I don't miss the worry, the constant stress about money, the fear that one bad day would ruin us." He took her hand. "And I don't miss leaving before you wake up and coming home after you're asleep. I'm grateful for every morning I get to have coffee with you now." "It's still hard to believe sometimes," Helen said, "that all of this came from giving someone back $8. "It came from more than that," Robert said. "It came from choosing to see another person's pain, from caring about a stranger, from believing that kindness matters even when you're struggling yourself." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple. Robert thought about the younger version of himself, the exhausted taxi driver who'd picked up a grieving businessman on a rainy morning. He wished he could go back and tell that man what was coming, that his small act of kindness would ripple outward in ways he couldn't imagine, that his life was about to change completely, that everything would be okay. But maybe that younger Robert wouldn't have believed it. Maybe he would have thought it was too good to be true, that things like that didn't happen to people like him, because that's what a lifetime of struggle teaches you, that miracles are for other people, that the best you can hope for is to survive another day. Except miracles do happen. They happen in small moments of connection between strangers. They happen when someone chooses compassion over convenience. They happen when we see each other's humanity and respond to it. They happen when kindness meets grief, when generosity meets need, when someone who has little gives to someone who has much but is lost. Robert had learned that kindness is never wasted, even when you can't see the results, even when nothing seems to change, even when you're tired and struggling and barely holding on yourself. The act of caring about another person always matters. It plants seeds that might not bloom for days or months or years, but they do bloom. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to see the garden that grows from a single seed of compassion. The next morning, Robert went to work at the Harrison Foundation office. They'd just received an application from a 60-year-old woman who worked 3 part-time jobs to support her disabled husband. Her letter described sleepless nights and constant worry, the fear that she couldn't keep going much longer but having no choice except to try. Robert approved emergency funds for her that morning. He also arranged for her to meet with their healthcare coordinator, who could help her husband get better support. Then he sat back and thought about the ripples spreading outward again. This woman's life was about to change. Her family would be okay, all because 2 years ago, on a rainy morning, a taxi driver and a CEO had met at exactly the right moment. That afternoon, Robert got a call from David. "There's someone I want you to meet," David said. "His name is Peter. He's a janitor at our building. His daughter needs surgery they can't afford. I told him about you, about how we met. He wants to hear the story." So Robert went and met Peter, and he told the story again, about the rainy morning, about the $8, about how one small choice had changed everything. Peter cried as he listened, and then he said something that Robert would never forget. "So you're telling me there's hope, even for people like us? Even when everything seems impossible?" Robert looked at this tired man with calloused hands and worried eyes, and he saw himself 2 years ago. "Yes," he said firmly. "There's always hope. Sometimes it comes from unexpected places. Sometimes it comes from strangers who become friends. Sometimes it comes from choosing kindness when logic tells you to protect yourself first. But it's there. Hope is always there, and it was true. Robert had learned that hope wasn't about waiting for life to get easier. It was about believing that kindness mattered, that people could change, that small acts of compassion could create big transformations. It was about seeing someone else's struggle and deciding to help even when you had struggles of your own. That night, Robert drove home thinking about all the lives that had been touched by that one moment. David, who'd remembered what his father taught him. Helen, who could finally stop worrying. 3,000 Harrison Technologies employees with better benefits. Hundreds of families helped by the foundation. Peter and his daughter, and countless others yet to come. All because a 63-year-old taxi driver saw a sad man in his rearview mirror and chose kindness over cash. All because he gave back $8 when he could have kept them. All because he believed, somewhere deep down, that caring about another person was always the right choice. The world tells us to look out for ourselves first, to protect what little we have, to be practical and realistic and not waste our resources on strangers. But Robert had learned something more important. He'd learned that the most valuable thing you can give someone isn't money or gifts or grand gestures. It's attention, recognition, the simple acknowledgement that they matter, that their pain is real, that they are seen. That's what he'd given David on that rainy morning. Not $8, but the gift of being truly seen. And David had given him the same gift back, had seen him not as just another employee, but as a person whose wisdom and kindness deserved to be honored. Two men from completely different worlds had found each other at exactly the right moment. One had money but had lost his way. The other had nothing but kindness to offer. And somehow, impossibly, that combination had created something beautiful, a friendship, a foundation, a better way forward. As Robert pulled into his driveway, he looked up at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. Somewhere up there, he liked to think, David's father was smiling. His sacrifice had meant something. His life had created ripples that were still spreading. And the lessons he'd tried to teach his son about kindness and compassion were now touching thousands of lives. That's the thing about kindness. It never dies. It multiplies. It spreads. It transforms. One act becomes 2, becomes 10, becomes 1,000. One moment of compassion can change a life, which changes another life, which changes the world in small but significant ways. Robert had been that taxi driver who gave back $8. But he'd become so much more. He'd become a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that small acts matter, that choosing compassion over convenience can literally change the world. And if one tired 63-year-old taxi driver could do it, then anyone could. That was the real message. That was the real hope. We all have the power to make a difference. We all have moments where we can choose kindness over self-interest. We all have opportunities to see someone else's pain and respond to it. The question is whether we will. Whether we'll give back those $8 even when we need them. Whether we'll see the humanity in strangers. Whether we'll believe that our small acts of compassion can create ripples that spread far beyond what we can imagine. Robert believed it now. He'd lived it. And every day in his work at the foundation, he helped other people believe it too. Because hope isn't about waiting for miracles. Hope is about creating them, one small act of kindness at a time.